Few people know that the same man who formulated the laws of gravity spent a good portion of his life trying to understand what happens to the soul after death. Isaac Newton, known for his work in physics and mathematics, also delved deeply into spiritual, biblical, and philosophical studies. For him, the material world was just one part of reality. What came afterward, what no one could see with their eyes, was as important as the planets revolving in the sky. Newton believed there was a purpose behind everything, including death. And what he wrote about it continues to surprise people today. He didn't accept simple answers. He asked questions that few dared to ask. And in his most personal notes, he described a vision of the afterlife that defies even the most common beliefs. What he discovered may change the way you look at your own days. Newton never openly disclosed all his ideas about what happens after the heart stops. Instead, he kept many of his thoughts in notebooks and letters that were only studied in depth centuries after his death. What was found there reveals a man divided between science and faith, but who sought to unite the two to understand the ultimate destiny of the human soul. He believed that consciousness did not disappear with the body, and more than that, he was convinced that the soul followed a path of learning, purification, and return to its origin, an origin he called divine. If you've made it this far, it's a sign that you also have this kind of curiosity. So please subscribe to the channel to continue receiving reflections that matter. If this content resonated with you, give it a thumbs up. That way, we can continue to grow together. Newton's words aren't easy to understand at first glance. He wrote in codes, often hiding what he really thought to avoid conflict with the religious dogmas of his time. Still, scholars have managed to decipher clear messages. One of them said that matter was just the visible manifestation of a greater reality, invisible to the eyes, but present in everything. For him, death was not an end, but a transition, something similar to a change of state, like ice turning into water. The body, as it dissolved, would release something essential, something that Newton believed carried memory, identity, and meaning. This something was the soul, and he said it could never be destroyed, only transformed. It's an idea that brings comfort to many and also raises new questions. Among his studies, Newton dedicated himself to translating ancient passages from the Bible and interpreting occult texts that spoke of the afterlife. Not as a traditional religious figure, but as an investigator seeking the logic behind beliefs. He said that the sacred book was more than metaphor. It was a kind of cosmic manual with clues about the workings of the universe and the journey of the soul. In his understanding, the soul wasn't judged simplistically. There wasn't just heaven or hell. There were stages, levels of evolution that varied according to each person's learning. He spoke of a just universe, where no one was forgotten and everyone had the chance to grow even after death. This went against many ideas of the time, but for Newton it made more sense than believing in eternal punishments. The most impressive thing is that Newton reached these conclusions without relying on mediums, visions, or supernatural experiences. He based his ideas on the observation of the natural world, ancient texts, and a rational faith. For him, everything that is true can be understood, even if only in part. And that included the soul. His reasoning was simple. If there's an intelligence behind creation, that intelligence wouldn't let the human spirit get lost in the void. There would be a continuity, a bridge between life and what comes after. Newton didn't draw this bridge in detail, but he left clear signs that he believed in it. And for many scholars, this may have been his greatest discovery, even though few people talk about it. Even in the last years of his life, when he was already recognized and respected throughout Europe, Newton continued writing about the destiny of the soul. He said that death was just the return of the spark to its point of origin. He used simple but weighty words: spark, essence, return. Nothing was by chance. He saw beauty in the logic of the universe, but he also saw purpose. He didn't believe in arbitrary punishments or empty rewards. He believed in continuity, in constant learning. And above all, he believed that the soul needed to be prepared for this return, prepared not with dogmas, but with awareness, the awareness of the good one does, of what one learns, of what one transforms. That for him was the true measure of evolution. This vision of continuity that Newton defended dialogues with many ancient spiritual traditions, but stands out for its rational character. He didn't want to convince through emotion, but through the coherence of facts, the logic of the universe. For Newton, the same order that made the planets revolve in harmony also governed the invisible journey of the soul. This means that, for him, nothing was lost, nothing was random. The lifetime, the experiences, the pains, the learnings, all had value and weight. It wasn't necessary to fear death, but rather to ignore its meaning. He saw death as a second birth, something that takes the soul back to its pure state, free from the limitations of the physical body. And the more we understand this in life, according to him, the more serene our return will be. Knowing this can change how we relate to each day we still have. In the writings that were kept hidden for decades, Newton spoke of the soul as a kind of traveler, an entity that travels through times, experiences, and dimensions in search of understanding. This idea didn't fit into the more rigid religious thinking of his time, so he kept these reflections secret. However, today, with access to these manuscripts, we can better understand what he meant. He didn't believe in a fixed or final judgment. The soul wasn't condemned for errors, but invited to reflect, to grow, to correct what it failed to learn. It was a vision that respected free will, but also pointed to a deep responsibility for the choices we make. Living, for Newton, was part of a larger process. Dying was just moving on to the next stage of that process. In some passages, Newton suggested that spiritual laws were as precise as physical laws. Just as gravity never fails, he believed that the soul followed invisible but constant laws. This is something that few people stop to think about, the idea that there is an invisible order to everything, including what comes after, and that this order doesn't depend on religion but on universal principles: doing good, cultivating knowledge, practicing justice, keeping the heart open to what is greater. All of this, for him, was part of what prepared the soul to move forward. He didn't speak of dogmas but of laws of nature. And at this point, science and spirituality ceased to be opposites and became complementary. This may be Newton's greatest contribution in this field. The most curious thing is that Isaac Newton, even being one of the most rational men in history, never considered himself just a scientist. He saw himself as a seeker of truth. And for him, the truth wasn't limited to what was visible. He believed that the entire universe was a creation with meaning, a language that could be read. But part of that language was beyond the eyes. The soul, for him, was an important key to deciphering this larger code. He didn't use words like miracle or blind faith. He preferred terms like order, purpose, cause, and consequence. Still, his vision was deeply spiritual, not out of mysticism, but out of logic. Because according to him, the simple fact that we are alive already indicated that there was something greater sustaining everything, and that something wouldn't leave the soul without a destiny. Unlike many thinkers of his time, Newton didn't see the soul as a prize or punishment. He saw it as part of the very fabric of the universe, something that runs through existence like an invisible thread, always in motion. This thread, according to him, connected each human being to a common origin. And that origin was sacred, not in the traditional religious sense, but as the essence of what is eternal and true. He said that, even when we don't understand, we are being guided by this connection. Therefore, suffering, loss, death wouldn't be the end. They would be parts of a cycle, like the phases of the moon or the seasons of the year. Knowing this doesn't take away the pain of losing someone, but it can transform the way we live and say goodbye. It can bring peace where there was only fear before. Many seniors, as they reach a certain age, begin to wonder what will come next. Sometimes these questions remain silent, out of fear, insecurity, or lack of answers. But when we look at figures like Newton, we realize that even the most lucid and rational minds asked the same questions, and they went after the answers. He didn't have all of them, but he had the courage to seek them. And his conclusions are an invitation to all of us. Let's not be afraid to reflect on life after death, not as an end, but as a next step, a step that can be more serene if it's prepared with awareness. And perhaps that awareness is, in the end, the greatest legacy we can leave for those who remain. Because it doesn't end with departure, it continues. This invitation to awareness that Newton leaves us is simple, but powerful. He reminds us that living isn't just passing the time, but building something within ourselves. And this something goes beyond memories, possessions, or titles. It's about developing an internal clarity, a lucidity about who we are and what we leave in the world. When we understand this, life takes on another weight, another value. It's not about the number of years, but about the quality of presence. It's about learning to see meaning, even in the small things. For Newton, every experience counted. Every thought, every choice was part of a larger process. Even mistakes had a function, as long as they generated learning. And if the soul continues, as he believed, then everything we do here is preparation for what will come after. Newton's vision didn't promise a heaven full of easy rewards. It also didn't speak of eternal hells. It was more demanding, more profound. It asked for responsibility, but it also offered hope. It said that there's always a next step. There's always the possibility of transformation. This makes sense for those who have lived a lot, because over the years we learn that life is made of phases, and that even in the most difficult moments, something within us resists, grows, evolves. Newton said that this something was the soul, and that it was in constant motion. For him, dying wasn't a tragic end, but a natural continuation, like changing rooms within the same house. And understanding this can bring a kind of serenity that no materialistic theory can offer. It's not about romanticizing death. Newton didn't do that. On the contrary, he was direct, realistic, sober. He knew that death causes pain, leaves absences, imposes difficult silences. But he also knew that the fear of death can be lessened when we look at it with more clarity, with more internal preparation. Death, according to him, doesn't need to be a taboo. It can be a stage that deserves to be understood, respected, even welcomed. And this doesn't mean giving up on life, but valuing the days we have even more. When we understand that the soul continues, we begin to take better care of everything it carries, the feelings, the bonds, the intentions. And this change of attitude affects everything. It affects how we look at ourselves, how we treat others, how we go through time. Isaac Newton lived to be 84 years old, an advanced age for his time. But even at the end of his life, his mind remained active, restless, in search of answers. He said that he was still like a child playing on the beach, picking up pebbles, while the great ocean of knowledge continued ahead, unexplored. This shows humility. And it also shows that even with all his knowledge, he recognized that there are things that we would only understand later. Perhaps death is one of them. But even so, he insisted on preparing himself, on thinking, on studying, on opening space for something greater. This attitude is something we can imitate, no matter the age, seeking meaning, seeking connection, seeking peace. These are attitudes that keep the soul alive, even in the face of the inevitable. By revisiting Newton's ideas, we're not just looking at the past. We're rediscovering a way of thinking that can be useful in the present. In a time when many people avoid talking about death, hiding aging, denying finitude, his words sound like a call to maturity, not to sadness, but to lucidity. Because only those who accept the reality of death can live with more truth. And living well is what makes death less feared. It's what gives dignity to the end and value to the middle. Newton knew this. He lived intensely, but never superficially. And he left us, without even knowing it, a possible map for dealing with the mysteries of the soul. A map that doesn't require blind faith, but a serene openness to the unknown. Of course, each person will interpret these teachings in a unique way. But there's something that cuts across all differences, the desire to understand what we are beyond the body. This question has moved humanity since the beginning of time. And if even Newton, with all his brilliance, dedicated himself to it, perhaps we should pay more attention to it as well, not as a constant fear, but as a natural preparation, like someone tidying up the house to receive an important visitor. Because if there really is a continuation as he believed, then it's worth arriving there with a clear conscience, with the soul at peace, the heart clean, and the mind serene. This may be the greatest wisdom we can take from this great man, not only about death, but about the way to live before it. Many times we expect ready-made answers about life after death. We want guarantees, absolute certainties, comforting promises. But Newton didn't offer that. He offered a path of reflection, an invitation to think deeply without haste, without illusions. This is something that may be uncomfortable at first, but it also frees you, because it takes away the burden of needing to have all the answers and puts the emphasis on living with meaning now. He believed that a life well lived was, in itself, the best preparation for what would come after. And this is within everyone's reach, regardless of age, belief, or history. Living with attention, with honesty, with a willingness to learn. These are the attitudes that shape the soul according to him, and that, in some way, help to build the crossing. What's impressive is that, even with such advanced ideas, Newton never sought to transform them into a doctrine. He didn't want to found a religion, nor to convince crowds. He wanted to understand. And this silent, almost solitary search shows how seriously he took this theme. For him, talking about the soul wasn't a game of pretty words. It was a real, practical need, as concrete as any equation. This seriousness is what gives strength to what he wrote, because it doesn't come from an attempt to manipulate, but to understand. And that's why when rereading his ideas, we feel that there is a simple and deep truth there, something that speaks to the most sincere part of ourselves. That part that knows that one day it will leave, but that also wishes to leave in peace. Perhaps that's why this content is so important for those who are living the most mature phase of life. It's at this stage that the questions become clearer. That time gains another rhythm and values are reorganized, and hearing from someone like Newton that the soul continues, that there is meaning at the end, that there is an order behind everything, can bring comfort without childishness. It can help transform fear into serenity, guilt into learning, doubt into seeking. Not with promises, but with clarity. And this clarity, for many, is worth more than any illusory certainty, because it prepares the heart for the inevitable, without fleeing, without denying, just accepting and honoring the natural cycle of existence, a cycle that, according to Newton, doesn't end, it just changes form. If each life has value, as Newton believed, then each farewell is also sacred, not in the ritualistic sense, but in the awareness that one cycle closes and another begins. This is true for those who leave and for those who remain, and it can change how we deal with losses. Instead of thinking about the end, we can start thinking about continuity, about legacy, about transformation. Newton shows us that it's not necessary to see the beyond, to trust that it exists. Just observe nature, the universe, the invisible order of things, and just look inside yourself with honesty, because it's inside that the seed of what makes us eternal lives, that which we call the soul, that which, even without knowing how to explain it, we feel that remains, that follows, that finds a new path. Even with so many discoveries and titles, Newton ended his life in silence, without great speeches, without dramatic farewells. But he left a thought that echoes to this day. That is worth more than theories or formulas, the idea that the soul is part of something greater, and that understanding this changes everything. It changes how we live, how we love, how we say goodbye. Not because he revealed the ultimate destiny, but because he showed us how to seek with humility, with logic, and with an open heart. If this message reached you today, perhaps it's not by chance. Perhaps you're at the right moment to hear this, and to transform this listening into a new way of looking at your own story, with more peace, more truth, and more presence. If this video touched something in you, remember to share it with someone who can also benefit from these words. Sometimes a simple conversation can calm the heart of those who need it most. And if you want to continue receiving content that informs and inspires with respect and clarity, subscribe to the channel. Here we believe that knowledge can be a hug, and that reflecting on the soul is not a sign of weakness but of maturity, that thinking about death is, in the end, a way to value life even more, and that even the greatest scientist in history can have something to teach us about the mysteries that no one sees, but that everyone feels. Because, as Newton said, everything that is true, however invisible it may seem, can be understood.